Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to Myra and to Leslie. And we appreciate this opportunity to collaborate and bring this topic to you all on actually a whole series on IPP strategies based on regional center and regional center services. So as Myra mentioned, my name is Sofia Cervantes, and I'm with the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. We are a state advocacy agency. We provide advocacy support to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We also support their families with advocacy support, and we have a systemic focus as well. So one of the ways that we provide support is one, by providing technical assistance, and all that means is the way the state calls it when we answer questions, right? So you could give us a call. We can answer questions related to anything disabilities. So if it's SSI, regional centers, special education, IHSS, something with housing related to individuals with disability, employment, etc. We can provide that technical support over the phone, and we then, sort of based on the common topics of the questions that we get, we created presentations, right? And so one of our roles is capacity building. So to increase the knowledge of people, to increase their skills in being able to access the services that they need. And so we do a range of trainings. I'll actually share it now and probably toward the end as well. But we provide trainings every Monday statewide. We provide trainings every Monday virtually at 10 a.m. And I'm going to flash the flyer on the screen just for a quick second. And the most important thing to know is our Zoom information remains the same all throughout the year. And so any Monday, 10 o'clock, if you want to check out what language we're doing, in what language we're doing the training and what topic we're doing, please feel free to tune in. We have the schedule of doing one topic on one Monday and then repeating that same topic in Spanish. And so you'll see that our flyers contain the date and what language we're doing that day, and then the topic and a little bit of information more in depth. So this is our August flyer, but in September, we will also be doing another series on systemic change. So if you see here, the information remains the same and the topics change. Okay, and so one of the ways that, again, we fulfill our role is by doing this capacity building. And you are welcome to join us anytime. And then lastly, just so you all know, part of our role is also working towards systemic change. So working to change the laws, the policies, the regulations that impact services for individuals with developmental and intellectual disabilities. And so you'll see us involved in that as well. Okay, so today we are here for the topic to begin the series that will be over the span of 3 months, once a month. We will be doing part 1 today of IPP strategies. Next month, we will do part 2 of IPP strategies. And then our last session of this series will be on fair hearing, the fair hearing process, and 4731 complaints. Okay, so one, please know that you will have access to all of the materials, and maybe if you're watching this on a recording, we will see if we can make a comment there and put the link to the materials. You will have access to this presentation and to all the materials that will be shared throughout the series. So very briefly, I will show you. Am I showing my screen? It looks like a Google Drive. Awesome. So when you click on the link that is on the chat right now, or that is on the comment section, if you're watching this later, you'll see eventually 3 folders, one for part 1, part 2, and part 3. Right now, you'll only see part 1. You will then see the folder separated into English and Spanish. So right now, we'll click English. The presentation itself contains a little star, and it has PowerPoint at the beginning, PPT. And so you will be able to have access already to this presentation. to the whole presentation. And then we also have what's called the IPP Strategy Guide. This is pretty much a booklet of what you will hear in part 1 and part 2 of this training. We also have a trifold to sort of review common regional center funded services for children ages 3 to 18. And if you scroll, you can see the range of services. And then one for adults. Okay. And so you'll have access, or you have access to this already. Okay. So that's what you could expect to find there. You know, we have 2 hours together, but as you all may know, time goes very quickly. It's a lot of info. And so luckily we do have 2 other opportunities that we can have together on this topic, but just in future, it might be helpful to refer back to these resources just for your own continued growth on the topic. Okay, and please feel free to reach out to us as well. On the chat, I will provide my phone number, and you can also subscribe to our newsletter so that you could remain up to date with events that we might be having, other training series with other, partners, or different things that we might be doing. All right. Okay, so we will begin now. And if you guys could give me a thumbs up if you can see the training now. Awesome. So IPP meeting strategies. And again, this is how to request services, avoid difficulties, and obtain the results that you need. And again, this is based on regional center services. On this first slide, you'll see our information. So my email is there. My phone number is there. Please feel free to reach out even beyond this training time. Okay. All right. So one of our goals for this collaboration, with Family Focused Resource Center with CSUN is to increase your confidence, your comfort level, your awareness of what IPP meetings could be like, should be like, for you to feel confident in your participation during these meetings, for you to even know how to prepare for when these meetings come up, right? So we will talk a little bit about the Lanterman Act, which is the law that, if you would, governs regional centers and dictates and indicates what services should be provided to individuals, anything related to regional center. Those parameters, those laws, we will find it within the Lanterman Act. Okay. And so, even think about it yourself. If you're a family member, even if you're a professional, right? Maybe you're from the regional center yourself, right? What do you feel when you think about your upcoming IPP meeting? Right? And feel free to write on the chat and kind of contribute that, right? What do you feel? And when we talk to parents, usually they'll say, well, I feel really nervous. I feel intimidated. I feel a little impotent in these meetings. I feel nervous, a range of emotions, right? And sometimes that's based on perhaps not knowing the legal foundation or your rights or all this. So with this series, we hope that you come out of this 3-part series knowing more and feeling more confident as you think of your next IPP meeting. Okay, so to begin, I would like us to do a bit of an exercise, if you would, a review activity. I have a few questions and they are true, false, and I will ask you to use the chat. And thank you. A person answered nervous, right? That you feel nervous when the IPP meeting is coming up. Thank you for sharing that on the chat. So I invite you to use the chat or to use the reaction function on, which allows you to put an X on your screen, or it allows you to put a green check mark. So I invite you to use those functions to participate in this activity, which will be true and false questions. No stress, don't worry. This is for you to know what you know, right? Sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And so this is sort of a way for you to be aware and know what it is that you know already. Okay, so again, feel free to use the chat and the reaction functions or the thumb up or whatever it is that you would like to use. Okay, you guys are all ready? Okay, so like a talk show host. So true, false, we will answer true, false to the following questions. So true, false, if my child has a diagnosis of autism, they are automatically eligible for the regional center. True or false? Okay, I see true on the chat by one person. I see true by another person on the screen. Anybody else? I see true, true. Okay. I see one person putting false. Okay. Awesome. We will be going through these. I will not give the answers now, but during our presentation, know that we will be answering to these questions. At the end of your presentation, don't look at it right now, no cheating. But at the end of the presentation, you also see these questions again, but with the correct answer. Okay. So most people on this question said true. We will find out if this is true indeed. Okay. All right, next question. The regional center must have an IPP meeting with me within 20 days after I ask for the meeting. True or false? The regional center must have an IPP meeting with me within 20 days after I ask for the meeting. I see someone saying false, someone else saying false. See if we get a few more. False. Okay. So the majority false on this one. We shall see. My IPP meeting must be held at the regional center office. True or false? My IPP meeting must be held at the regional center office. Someone put false, false. Okay. I see someone else putting false. Now, a different variation. My IPP meeting must be held in my home. True or false? I see a person putting false, false, false. Okay, very well. I have the right to record my IPP meeting. True or false? You guys are doing very well. Or I guess I shouldn't say that. We will see. I have the right to record my IPP meeting. True or false? Someone's saying true. Someone else is saying true. True. Okay. We continue. I have to sign my IPP document the same day of the meeting for my child services to continue. True or false? I have to sign my IPP document the same day of the meeting for my child services to continue. I see two people saying false. Okay, we'll continue. True, false. The regional center service policies are the ones that determine what services I can get and which I can't. True or false? This may feel like a trick question. Okay, someone's saying false. Thank you to those participating. Okay, another person says true to this one. So sort of a divided answer here. We will see. Okay, next, and we have a few more. True, false. My child can receive mental health counseling services through the regional center if needed. True or false? Someone answers true, another person answers true. Another person answers true. Okay. The regional center is the last to pay for the services my child needs. True or false? The regional center is the last to pay for services my child needs. Someone says true. Another person says true. Another person says false. False. Okay, sort of a divided answer here. All right. The regional center must offer me the service that is appropriate and least expensive. True or false? Someone says true. The regional center must offer me the service that is appropriate and least expensive. I see one false. Okay. And I think we have two more. If my child has severe behaviors and is at risk of being a danger to self or others, the regional center must offer options for him/her to move away from home into a group home. If my child has severe behaviors and is at risk of being a danger to self or others, the regional center must offer options for him or her to move away from home into a group home. Okay, someone says true. Okay. And last one here. So true, false. I have the right to appeal and request a hearing when the regional center denies a service. True or false? Okay, true, true. I see another true. Okay, very good. Okay, so this brings us to the end of this true false. Now you'll see that we will be answering these questions through the presentation, right? So the first question that we talked about, and pardon me for this effect, I forgot to take that off. A little distracting, huh? So the first question that we asked was, if my son has a diagnosis of autism, he automatically qualifies for or is eligible for regional center services. And I believe, if I remember correctly, most people answered true to that one. The answer is actually false. Okay, so if a person has autism, it does not automatically make them eligible for regional center services. And the reason for that is the eligibility criteria for regional center is a 4-part eligibility criteria. One of those includes having a diagnosis, and one of them is the diagnosis of autism. But the truth is that they can have a diagnosis of autism, but if they don't meet the other 3 requirements to be eligible for regional center, then they may not be eligible for regional center, even if they have the diagnosis of autism. Okay, so that first question is actually false. So let's look at, based on the Lanterman Act, what is the eligibility criteria? And here I would like to make a distinction between eligibility criteria and diagnosis, because this is what we're facing here, right? A diagnosis is just the diagnosis, right? They have epilepsy, or they have autism, or they have intellectual disability. That's a diagnosis by itself. But when we talk about an eligibility criteria, whether it's for regional center or other systems, they usually are more than just one thing, right? They have to demonstrate this, 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 and this, right? Not always 4 things, but they have to demonstrate a series of things in order to be found eligible for whatever service we're talking about, or whatever system we're talking about. In this case, for regional center, there are 4 things that must be true in order to be eligible for regional center services. Okay, so 1, the person's condition had to begin before the age of 18 years old. So regional center focuses on developmental disabilities. So developmental disabilities usually are developed right before the age of 18. We see conditions where a person will experience needs throughout their development and into their adulthood, but it usually begins in the earlier years of life. So to be eligible for regional center services, 1, the person must demonstrate that their condition began before the age of 18. So, for example, if someone is diagnosed with autism later in life, right, or someone is diagnosed with Alzheimer's, or due to a brain injury later in life, they develop an intellectual disability, but the injury occurred at 35 years old, they would not be found eligible for regional center because they have a condition, but it did not begin before the age of 18. Okay, now to clarify, the person doesn't have to arrive at regional center before the age of 18. And what I mean by that is, let's say there's a person who had autism. Let's say they were diagnosed when they were 5 years old, but the person never knew about regional center until they turned 30 years old. That person could come to regional center and ask for an assessment, right? An eligibility assessment. And that person would have to demonstrate that their condition began before the age of 18, even though they are now 30. Right? So the condition had to have begun before the age of 18, and the task of the person will be to demonstrate that that is true, right? That the condition was developed before the age of 18. So that's number 1, right? The first thing that has to be true in order to be eligible. Number 2, they have to have one of the following diagnoses or conditions, right? 1, developmental disability, which, or one of the following developmental disabilities. 1, intellectual disability, which was formerly known as mental retardation. We do not use that term anymore. We use ID, which is intellectual disability. So they have to either have intellectual disability, 2, cerebral palsy, 3, autism, 4, epilepsy, or what we call the 5th category, which is a condition similar to intellectual disability. So let's say someone has a brain injury at the age of 5, 6, and that brain injury, whatever it may be called, left the person with needs that are similar to an intellectual disability. Even though they don't have one of the labels or one of the specific diagnoses here listed here, they may qualify under the 5th category because their condition resembles that of an intellectual disability. Okay, so again, in order to be found eligible for regional center services based on the Lanterman Act, the person's condition must have developed before the age of 18. They have to demonstrate one of the following developmental disabilities, which would be 1, either intellectual disability, cerebral palsy, autism, epilepsy, or a 5th category, a similar condition to intellectual disability. Okay, so those are 2 so far. 3, they could be below the age of 18. They could be diagnosed with autism, but they must also demonstrate that they have a substantial disability. And the way that that is assessed is the person must demonstrate substantial disability in at least 3 of the following 7 areas. Okay, and those areas are self-care, and we'll go through these with a little bit more detail right now, but the 7 are self-care, receptive and expressive language, learning, mobility, self-direction, capacity for independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. The last two are usually for adults. But so the person must have developed the condition before the age of 18. They must have one of the diagnoses identified. And 3, they must demonstrate that they have substantial disability in at least 3 of these 7 areas. Okay, so self-care, and keep in mind that whenever the person is assessed, these areas of life are looked at based on their age, right? So self-care, when a person is young, 3, 4, this area, usually they don't have much skill or independence yet, right? They need help brushing their teeth, bathing, getting ready, preparing food. They don't do that, right? But so we would look at self-care, or regional center would look at self-care based on their age and where they should be, right? So developmentally. Okay, so self-care would include these things we've mentioned: grooming, bathing, preparing food, taking care of self. Okay, the second area is receptive and expressive language. And it's important to identify then that those are 2 different things, right? Receptive language is the communication that you receive, right? So I am able to receive, process, and understand information. And then expressive language is the language that I provide, that self-expression. And so communication is usually a combination of those 2 things, right? We often call them circles of communication, right? A circle would be someone tells me something, I process it, understand it, and return a response. That would be one circle, right? So, hi, good morning, right? I received that receptive language, and then I would say, oh, hi, good morning, right? Expressive, that's kind of one circle. Oh my gosh, it's so hot, huh? Right? A person may tell me, I received that information. I say, oh my gosh, yes, it is. I have my air conditioning on, right? So circles of communication. And so sometimes with individuals with a developmental disability, we see that there may be a need in both of those communication processes or in one of those. Sometimes we assume that if a person does not have a lot of expressive language, we also assume that they struggle with receptive language. Sometimes that's true, sometimes that's not. What we also misinterpret sometimes is that we think because a person can speak, they also are processing everything you're saying. And that itself is not always true, right? So think of your own child, think of the individuals that you might work with. It's important to identify where is the break in communication. Is it their receptive language or their expressive language? Are they receiving, processing, understanding what another person is saying? Is that where their need is, or is their need in their expressive language, right? So a person may need support with their receptive or expressive language. So it's important to know the combination of these 2. It's important to identify whether our loved ones, where is their break in communication? Okay, they may not have trouble with expressive language, but because they have trouble with receptive, they're not sure what to answer because they didn't quite receive the message you gave them, right? So you might have in your language used literal or abstract communication. You might have said a joke, you might have been sarcastic. If their receptive language has some need, if they're not fully developed in their receptive language, they may not have understood all those nuances, sarcasm, and so it prevents their expressive language, right? And so we have to be mindful of that. So when regional center is assessing these needs, right here it says receptive and expressive language. So let us not be fooled, right, by thinking, oh, if a person is nonverbal, it means they also don't understand. No, their receptive language may be intact. It's just their expressive. But also, let's not be fooled by the opposite. Just because a person communicates doesn't mean that they're receiving all the messages. Sometimes a person has expressive communication, but only in limited pockets of topics, right? So, or yeah, in limited pockets, right? So if you talk to me about dinosaurs, oh, you may get a lot of communication from me, right? If you talk to me about astronomy, if you talk to me about cars, then I am super expressive. But if you talk to me about other topics, I may not be. And so, the assessment for receptive and expressive language, giving it some thought is going to be important, right? 3, learning. The other area is learning. And so learning usually involves the skill of being able to take information in, retain it, and apply it at a later time, right? So learning is a process of taking in information and processing it, retaining the information, and then using or applying the lessons learned or whatever was processed later on. Okay, so learning would be assessed. Mobility is also one of those areas that regional center looks at, right? So this involves movement, coordination, sometimes executive functioning, right? Executive functioning sort of means the way that we're able to use our whole body in sync, right? The way we're able to sort of synchronize movement and coordination and all of that, okay? So then self-direction. And self-direction, again, may look different depending on the age. Self-direction for an adult might look different, but self-direction exists from the beginning in different ways, right? For example, I have a 7-year-old niece, 7 going on 13, if you know what I mean, right? They've got a full character and sometimes attitude already, right? But so she's 7 years old. Since she was probably 3 or 4, if her tia hid the cookie jar and put it on top of a cabinet or on top of the fridge or whatever, she problem solved, brought a little chair, climbed the chair, used the chair to climb the counter, opened the cabinet, climbed the cabinet shelves, and then reached for the cookie jar. That is self-direction, right? At her young age. And so when we're looking at self-direction, we're looking at, can they problem solve to be able to lead themselves through whatever issue, right? So if, let's say, you have a teenager and the teenager is playing video games, but somehow the controller falls behind the couch. Self-direction, appropriate self-direction at a teenage age would be to be able to say, oh man, my control fell, right? Let me go look for, I don't know, maybe a broom and kind of kneel down and use the long stick of the broom to sort of kick the controller out of the couch and then be able to grab the controller and resume playing, right? That is an example of self-direction. But if, let's say, the teenager that you work with or your son or daughter that's a teenager, they're playing a video game, the controller falls, and it's a complete sort of deregulated event. Excuse me, they begin crying, they get frustrated, they may become self-injurious. That is an indication there is a need in self-direction, right? They have a substantial disability in self-direction. And again, in describing substantial disability, we would say there is a substantial gap between the skill in these areas that someone who does not have a disability and is their same age, there is a large gap between their ability, right? Someone of their same age without a disability and their ability, right? Someone with a disability. So when we say substantial disability, we are saying there is a gap between these two abilities. That demonstrates my son, daughter needs support with self-direction, with self-care, with receptive and expressive language, with learning, mobility, etc. The last two areas, again, are more so for when assessing adults, but nevertheless, they are capacity for independent living. right? A capacity for independent living and economic self-sufficiency. So would they be able to live alone? Would they be able to care for themselves and their home in a manner that would allow them to live independently? And would they be able to sustain employment? Is really what economic self-sufficiency kind of is, right? Would they be able to manage their budget? Would they be able to bring in financial resources or not? Okay, so again, we're reviewing these 7 areas that Regional Center would assess when exploring eligibility for a person. Okay, the last thing for eligibility is it is expected for the person's condition to last indefinitely. That means the Regional Center, when they assess, they determine, yep, this condition is expected to be for their whole life. At each developmental stage, they are going to have needs. Okay. And so the last bullet on this criteria, this 4-part criteria, is again, it is expected to last indefinitely. Okay. So again, this section that we're reviewing right now is in response to our first question. Is it enough, right, for a person to just have autism? What do they qualify for Regional Center? No, right? They have to demonstrate, 1, that the condition began before the age of 18. 2, they must demonstrate one of the conditions that was listed, including autism, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, intellectual disability, or a 5th category. 3, and sometimes the one that takes a bit more assessment and exploration, is do they have substantial disability in at least 3 of the following 7 areas on your screen? And 4, is the condition expected to last indefinitely? Okay, if that is true, all 4 are true, then they would be found eligible. Okay, now, if the Regional Center finds or says they are not eligible because they don't demonstrate substantial disability in at least 3 of the 7 areas, and you say, as the parent, say, they demonstrate substantial disability in more than the 3 areas. Actually, I think it's all 7. Then that is where you may go to a fair hearing and appeal the Regional Center's denial for eligibility for Regional Center services. And during that fair hearing, your focus would be demonstrating how it is that they do have a substantial disability in at least 3 of the 7 areas. Okay. Now, when talking about these 7 areas, I really like to, I've sort of gone into detail on them because if you already are eligible, and I'm assuming most of the family members here, your son or daughter is eligible already and has Regional Center services, what's important is remember the reason that your son or daughter was found eligible for Regional Center services to begin with were because they demonstrated substantial disability in at least 3 of these areas. So one of the strategies, one of the ways that you may prepare for your IPP meeting is coming back to these 7 areas and think, what are the needs under each of these life areas, right? What are their needs for self-care, for receptive and expressive language, for learning, for mobility, for self-direction, independent living, and self-sufficiency, right? If this is what got us in the door and made us eligible, let's not forget about these 7 life areas, right? Let's use those to help us prepare and think about the gaps that still exist for our sons and daughters, right? So if they were eligible because they were found to have substantial disability in self-care, learning, mobility, and self-direction, let's revisit these areas every year to make sure we have goals and services that address these needs, right? So these 7 areas are important for us to keep in mind. And again, not only for eligibility purposes, but thereafter, right? To be able to say, okay, this is what made them eligible. Let's talk about how they still demonstrate needs. Later on in the presentation, we will talk about the fact that parents have the right to write, have the right to write a parent report, right? And sometimes parents may say, well, ooh, how do I write a report, right? And maybe a report sounds a little bit intimidating and sounds like, ooh, I don't know what to write, right? I know my kid, but I don't know what to write. I propose to you, your report could simply, and it wouldn't be a simple thing, it would be a amazing thing if you did a parent report, but it could simply be parent report and the categories or the headings of self-care with bullet points expressing or identifying the needs under self-care. Next section of the report, receptive and expressive language and how they have needs, right? My son becomes frustrated and becomes self-injurious due to the lack of communication. My son doesn't understand directions and therefore cannot complete tasks and gets frustrated, which leads to behaviors. My son or daughter doesn't have friends because they're not able to currently communicate. They don't understand the language and they don't express, right? This is how we could build a parent report, putting bullet points under each of these life areas, and that would be our report, right? A report, a parent report with 7 headings and bullet points under each of those headings. And remember, your son or daughter having a need in an area, again, a need is there is a gap between their ability, your son's or daughter's ability, and the ability that a person of their same age without a disability has, right? So when we think of what is a need, what does my son need? Think of the gap. What can an 8-year-old without a disability do in the area of self-care that your son or daughter is not yet, right? That's why they are considered to have that developmental disability. That is why Regional Center and other services are there to support the person in closing this gap by giving them services to develop abilities, right? Now, coming back to this 4th point, even when they make progress, keep in mind the condition is expected to last indefinitely, right? They may make progress, okay? And it doesn't mean that in their next developmental phase, they're not going to need support anymore. Just because they developed good skills right now, it doesn't mean they're not going to need services later in their life. A developmental and intellectual disability, a developmental disability is precisely that. They will have needs and they will require support throughout their life, right? A brief example of what I'm hoping to express by saying all this is, a teenager may have learned teenage social skills, right? So not all teenagers are the same, but some teenagers, the way they say hi to each other and the whole fist bumps and what's up, dude, and the hugs and the chest bump, however teenagers say hello, using all the phrases that they pick up from TikTok or whatever is cool, during that time, right? But so let's say your son or daughter has made tremendous progress in their social skills, and maybe even Regional Center says, oh, your son doesn't need services anymore. Look how well they're doing. It's going to be important for us to remember, yes, they've made progress and they're doing awesome. But given the fact that they have a developmental disability, what that tells me is that as they move to the next phase of their life, they are likely going to need support again. And in this example of a teenager and social skills, so again, the teenager learned the teenage social skills, but now they're an adult. And now they have to go to a job interview and their social skills are still at maybe teenage level. And so, I'm being sarcastic and exaggerating here, but this is when we might see them walking into their interview and saying, what's up, homie? Right. And the employer might be like, whoa, okay, right? Because they now need support for social skills at an adult level, right? So what this last sort of bullet indicates is someone with a developmental disability will require supports throughout their life, especially, if I may, sort of personal opinion, especially in this transition between developmental phases, right? From a toddler to their next stage, from this stage to this stage, and as a teenager to to an adult, all of these transitions, it is expected that they will require support, right? One point that I'd like to make here, sometimes, and sort of going back to the fact that the state council, we are advocates, right? We're not attorneys or anything, we're advocates. And so some of the examples that we give are based on phone calls we've received. And so in the past, we've received phone calls where they, call us and tell us, regional center is telling me that my son's not going to qualify for regional center anymore because he's made so much progress. And so based on the Lanterman Act, what would happen in that scenario is actually the regional center would have to demonstrate that when they initially made the assessment and found the person to be eligible, if they are later saying that they no longer qualify, it's not as easy as saying they've made progress, they don't qualify anymore. The regional center would actually have to go back and demonstrate that their initial assessment was erroneous, meaning they made a mistake. It was an error that they identified that the condition was going to last indefinitely. And this makes sense, right? Because if at 4 years old, they said that the person was eligible, and thus they agreed that the condition is expected to last indefinitely, if later when they're 19 years old, they're saying, oh, they don't need help anymore, they don't have a disability anymore. Well, initially, you found that they were going to have a disability that would last indefinitely. So if you're ever faced with that scenario where a regional center might express to you, they're not going to qualify for services anymore, they're kind of graduated, they don't have a disability that requires support anymore, keep in mind that regional center would actually have to demonstrate that they made an error when they did their assessment to grant eligibility. Okay, so something to keep in mind. Okay, so as we move on to the next section, I want to pause quickly in terms of exploring any questions. Any questions specifically about what we've discussed, and technically what we've discussed thus far is the eligibility criteria for the Lanterman Act. Any questions so far? Feel free to write on the chat. I'll give us a quick second. Okay. No questions, I see.
Yes, there's no questions.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Myra. All right, so we will continue. And feel free, as we go through the presentation, please feel free to input your questions on the chat and I can take them as we go. So as we're talking about, our topic of IPP strategies, how to, effectively advocate and what strategies would be effective in preparation for my IPP meeting. One thing that is important for us to keep in mind is that when we're going to request services, right? So we were already found eligible. We already have a service coordinator. We have a meeting coming up, an IPP meeting, okay? It's important for us to not simply go to the meeting and ask for services, but rather use the formula, okay? And by formula, we mean the following. Many times we hear from family members, I went to the meeting and I asked for services and they told me no, they denied everything. And what we find is what unfortunately the parent in this case, or the person's support person or caretaker, what they may have failed to do was to use the formula And the formula is described by this pyramid that you see on your screen. This formula is in form of a pyramid, meaning it's not effective to start at the top and just ask for services, but rather the effective process is usually establishing the need, developing goals for the IPP, and then requesting a service. Okay, so again, services are based on goals. Goals are based on needs. So if we haven't built the case and demonstrated the need that our son or daughter has, and we haven't established goals, then sort of technically the regional center may not have a responsibility of providing services, because services are based on the IPP, they're based on goals, and if there are no goals, that means there's no needs. And if there's no needs, then why would they offer any services, right? And so really the effective way to prepare for our participation in IPP meetings is making a list of the needs. And remember that we talked about the parent report. That's where the parent report can become very, very useful, right? The report can help you discuss and put on paper, right, all of the needs that your son or daughter has. And again, let me trace back to our previous slide. Needs in what areas? These 7, because this is what made them eligible, right? So areas of need in these 7 areas of life, right? So once we establish the needs under self-care, under mobility, under self-direction, once we've established those needs, then what's our next step? Along with the IPP team, which often includes the regional center service coordinator, right? Maybe their supervisor, maybe other people. As a team, we create goals, right? If we establish that there's needs, that there are needs under self-care, then what should we have? A self-care goal. Once we have a self-care goal, we're saying we got to work on some stuff, right? So what's going to help us work on these things we're identifying? Services. So once we take care of establishing the need, once we develop goals that are on the IPP, it should become smoother to ask for a service. And if the regional center were to deny that service, then it really wouldn't make sense, right? Because if they were to say, okay, there's needs, we're creating these goals, but we're not going to give you any services, the conversation kind of should flow naturally. And the natural question would be, I'm kind of confused. How are we going to work on these goals if we have no intervention, if we have no services, right? And so the effective process is to use this formula, right? Explain the problem and the results you need to resolve it, right? This is the need, and these are the services we would need in order to accomplish these goals. And so the formula is, there is a need, and the service you are requesting is necessary to ensure that you are able to live on your own, be independent, and or be included in your community. Okay, and I want to pause for a second there to highlight, if you're taking notes, if you've printed this out and want to highlight, these things are going to be really important. So services are necessary to ensure that you're able to live on your own, be independent, or on your own and in your own home, to be independent and or be included in your community. This bottom portion of this paragraph is really key for the following reason. The Land Tribune Act indicates that regional center services are there for the following 3 things: to allow a person to remain in their own home and community versus being in an institution, okay? 2, to maximize independence, okay? 3, health and safety, and 4, being included in their own community. So integration. Again, if you're taking notes, the 4 key areas would be, and I might mix up the order right now, but the 4 key areas are health and safety, being able to live in your own home and community, maximizing independence, and integration in your community. So what is really important is that any service we're asking for, we should connect it to one of these 4 things. Is the service I'm asking for, is it being requested for the health and safety of the person, for the person to be able to stay in their own home, for them to increase independence, or for them to be integrated in their community? It's important. It's the way that we can speak the regional center's language, right? Because that's what regional center is focused on, right? Because the law says that's their role. Provide services based on the person's need in order to allow them to ensure these 4 things. So if we're asking for services, but kind of vaguely and not anchoring them on these 4 reasons, or not using this language, that's where maybe there might be some disconnect in the communication between families and regional center, right? So it's important for us to sort of develop this ability to speak the language that's on the Land Term Act, right? And again, hope I'm not repeating it too often, but for clarity's sake, those 4 areas are health and safety, allowing the person to live in their own home and community, maximizing independence, and being integrated in their community. I need a personal assistant for which of these 4 things, right? It will be good to walk into that meeting knowing, why do I need each service, right? What is it connected to? Which of these 4, sometimes it might be connected to all 4, but which of these 4 is the need connected to? Why am I saying I need this service? Why is it the regional center's responsibility? If we can't sort of answer those questions or demonstrate the need and demonstrate how they will support the person's goals for health and safety, independence, integration, and remaining in their own home, that's where we might find ourselves with a lot of denied services, right? And again, it will be to our benefit to be able to establish the need, develop goals with the IPP team, and then request services, okay? We won't talk about fair hearings right now or appeals, but know that you can follow this process. When you ask for services, if they are approved, wonderful. Make sure that that is written onto your IPP. One step further, actually, request that the date that the service will begin is written onto the IPP. You can also request that maybe the provider that they plan to give you the service through, that is also indicated on your IPP, so that we don't find ourselves with too much of a gap between the meeting and the actual start of services. Okay, so again, you follow this process. Let's say services are approved, wonderful. You're going to make sure all of that we talked about right now is in your IPP. But let's say it was still denied, then that is where you can always request a fair hearing. You can always appeal that denial, which means you would request the fair hearing. And that fair hearing process, in that fair hearing process, your role would be to demonstrate what? The need, and why this service is so necessary to be able to work on the goals that were established based on the person's individual needs. Okay, so again, when we talk about a formula, that is what it is. Establish needs, develop goals, and request services. I'm going to pause for a second and look at the chat here. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Myra. Myra is again on the chat putting the link where you can access this presentation and other related resources. Thank you very much for that. Okay, and also this presentation is going to be uploaded to the FFRC YouTube channel. You can view this later and take notes, print out the presentation, whatever might be helpful. Okay, and here it is, and the YouTube link is there. Thank you, Myra, for that. Okay. Any questions on this concept itself of the formula or this process that we just discussed? Okay, awesome. So we're going to review now a few of the fundamentals or the basics to understand based on the Lanterman Act. Okay, so based on the law of the Lanterman Act says that there are no minimum and no maximum amount of services. Okay, what it says is services should be individualized and they are based on the need. So the Lanterman Act puts no minimum and no maximum of amount of services. So what that means is if there is a person who is found eligible for regional center services, but currently they're receiving all of their services through the school district, through their insurance, through their private insurance, through community, free services, and they don't need anything from regional center right now, that's cool, right? There's no minimum. They can have 0 services by regional center and still be a regional center client, but with 0 services because right now they don't have needs that need to be covered by the regional center. Okay, completely the opposite to that. Let's say there's a person who was found eligible for regional center services and they demonstrate a lot of needs and have a lot of goals on their IPP and thus require a lot of services. There is nothing in the law that says there is a maximum number of services. There isn't a dollar amount. Okay, the law does not say each person shall have a maximum of 6 services or use a maximum of $10,000, right? The law does not say that. The law specifies there is no minimum, there is no maximum. The amount of services is based on the person's individual needs, right? And therefore, we again realize why establishing the need is so important. Okay, and so there is no minimum, there is no maximum amount of services. Okay, the law again says that services should be individualized, right? So based on the person's individual needs. Okay, if your son or daughter has a diagnosis, has a condition that is 1 in a million, right? It's a need that he or she has that maybe the regional center has never encountered before. Excuse me, because the law says that services should be individualized, it does give regional center a responsibility to develop or work with you to come up with something that will fulfill the need, even if they don't currently have that service or that thing to fulfill the person's need. If you were ever told, oh, we've never seen this, we don't have anything for this, respectfully, the law says it's individual needs, right? I hear you, right? If regional center were to say this, I hear you in that this service has never been provided. And also I'm expressing and letting you know my son has this need. And based on the law, services should be based on the need, right? You may not have the service because you've never seen it, but it's a need that my son or daughter has. Okay. And so the regional center has that responsibility to work with you to develop or to somehow arrange for that need to be met. Okay. The amount of the dollar amount, that is spent on your son or daughter through the regional center is based on the established need. Okay. And so what that means is there isn't a minimum maximum of services. So there isn't really a dollar amount that is a cap or a minimum that could be spent on your son or daughter. The dollar amount is based on the need. So what we see here is if someone has very little needs, they're likely going to have very little services, and thus there's going to be a very low budget associated with their regional center case because they have low needs, right? Low number of needs. On the contrary, and supported by the Lanterman Act, if a person has a lot of need, probably means that they will have a lot of goals, thus a lot of services, thus definitely a higher budget amount associated with their case. And again, based on the Lanterman Act, no minimum, no maximum. The dollar amount, the number of services is directly related to the amount of need that the person has. So again, sort of highlighting the importance or why it's so important for you to be aware as the parent, as the advocate of your loved one, for you to be aware what are their needs. That's almost, if you would, that's the most important job, right? To demonstrate the need, to then say, let's create goals and let's get services that are appropriate for my son or daughter, right? Now, there are regional center purchase of service policies. You'll remember that we had a true and false question at the beginning related to purchase of service policies. Okay. Regional center has the freedom to develop purchase of service policies. You'll sometimes hear these referred to as POS, right? Purchase of service policies, POS policies. And so regional center can have policies, but so a policy can be something that provides some kind of limit based on a scenario that they've created or thought of. For example, right, a regional center, this is made up, okay? A regional center may say, we have a respite policy. And our respite policy is that when a parent has a child with autism, and the parent it's a single parent household, the person has a son or daughter with autism, and they have a lot of needs. The regional center can say, we provide a maximum of 40 hours a month of respite for this type of family, right? They can make guidelines like that, purchase of service policies for themselves, right? They can definitely have those policies. However, because the Lanterman Act says there's no maximum and there's no minimum, what they do have to do is that policy always has an exception clause, because a policy cannot be more restrictive than the law, which says there is no maximum or minimum amount of services. The policy can also not be more restrictive than the law that says services should be individualized, right? Or the term that we hear also, person-centered, right? Based on the person's need. And so when we look at this, then we're saying the law always trumps the policies. So yes, regional center may have policies, but if you remember your question, the question would have been false, because the policies do not determine the services your son or daughter gets. Their need is what determines what services they should receive. So regional center is free to have policies, but know that each policy has an exception clause, because if you can demonstrate that based on their need, on your need and your family's need, you guys need more respite hours, then so be it, right? That policy is there, but it kind of gets trumped by the fact that if your individualized case requires something different or something more, then based on the Lanterman Act, that is what should happen. Okay. And so again, the regional center can develop policies, but it can never be more restrictive than the law. Okay. And the way that that is managed is sometimes by the policies having exception clauses. So if you ever get denied a service because of a policy and you feel that you are an exception to that policy based on your individual needs, then that is when it would be a great opportunity for you to consider appealing and asking for a fair hearing, where you would demonstrate, I am the exception to this policy. This policy says no more than 40 hours for this type of family. I am this type of family, but I've got more needs, more individualized needs that I believe should grant me more hours, even though that policy says that your cap is 40. Okay. So I hope that that concept is clear, right? So again, based on our true false question, the Lanterman Act always trumps the regional center policies as needed. And what the law says is that services should be based on individual needs, right? And that there is no maximum and no minimum. Okay. So these are important concepts to know when we're advocating within, our IPP meeting. Now, here we're going back to this concept that we discussed earlier. Based on the Lanterman Act, the goal and the objective of regional center is to ensure these four things, right? Which I actually referred to earlier during the pyramid slide, right? Health and safety, so that they can live typical lives. The Lanterman Act also says the goal and objective of services provided through regional center are to allow, right, individuals to be able to live in their own home versus being placed in institutions. Okay. Prior to the 1960s, individuals with developmental and intellectual and other disabilities were housed in large institutions away from their families, segregated from their communities. In the 1960s, when the Lanterman Act was written, the goal became, let's get people out of those institutions back into our communities, right? So instead of segregated, we want them integrated. And so part of the reason why regional center exists is to provide services that will allow for people to remain with their own families and their own communities with the supports and services that they need, right? If they were in institutions before because they had needs, then the goal is let's get them living in their own homes, and regional center provide the services that will fulfill their need and will allow them to remain at home. Okay, again, with their families in their communities. The other goal of the Lanterman Act is to increase independence, right? And keep in mind, at every age level, right? Independence based on the things that a 4-year-old is doing. Independence based on the things that an 8-year-old without a disability is doing independently, right? And so you may be requesting services to increase independence and close that gap that we talked about, right? That gap between the skills that a person of your son's same age range would have without a disability. We want to close that gap. And then lastly, the goal of the Lanterman Act, and thus the goal of why regional center provides services, is to allow for the person to be in the least restrictive environment. We see this concept used a lot in special education, right? So least restrictive environment, meaning not in institutions, in their own home. But even when they're in their own home, we want them to be able to access the community the way any other person can. So if you say, well, my son or daughter has a lot of behaviors, so he could just, he can't go into the community because, gosh, we would need one or two people helping me to take him to the community. That is what least restrictive environment means, and integration. That if your son or daughter requires additional support to be able to be integrated in his community rather than segregated and very restricted in his home, so be it. That is what you'd be advocating for, right? I need a personal assistant. I need more respite hours. I need more, whatever it may be, to allow that person to have some community integration and be in the least restrictive environment. Okay. So very important to identify these are the goals of the Lantern Act. Okay. And again, repeating what I mentioned earlier, it's going to be so important, therefore, to connect whatever service it is that you're asking for, connecting it to one of these 4 legal foundations, right? I'm requesting this service to ensure their health and safety. I'm requesting this service because it's going to help me support them at home versus having to say, I can't support my son at home anymore. They're going to have to go to a home or an institution, right? Or to increase their independence, especially if they're adults. As a parent, I could imagine you want to support your son forever. However, keep in mind that the goal is also for them to have the type of independence that would allow them to live independently from their parent. And so the goal is that it's not always the parent's continued job to provide direct support for their son or daughter when they're adults. Why? Because eventually, and I know that when I speak with parents, a lot of parents say, man, my biggest fear is what's going to happen when I'm not around, right? And that is a whole other training and topic and sensitive topic, but I bring it up because it's important to recognize, yes, I'm their parent. Yes, I love them and want to support them. But the way that I want to support them while I'm here and healthy and strong is by helping them set up a life independent without me. So that if and when, knock on wood, I'm no longer around, my son or daughter has everything that he or she needs set up to live an independent life, integrated in their community, in the least restrictive environment without needing me. So yes, as an adult, you still have certain responsibilities toward your son or daughter. But when it comes to them living independently, technically that's not your role anymore. At 18, a parent usually, right, can let go and say, well, you've got to get a job now. Well, I don't know that, we're going to need to move out to a smaller place. I think you're going to need to look for a place of your own. And hear me out on this. I'm not saying that's going to happen with your family and that you're going to say, all right, son, daughter, you got to get moving, right? Hit the road. I'm not saying that, but I am saying in terms of when speaking to regional center, it's important to have very firm in your mind, yes, I am their parent, but certain things are no longer my responsibility. And therefore, I am requesting for those services and supports to come from regional center so that they can be given directly to my son or daughter without my involvement, because that is the goal. Independence means the parent is not as involved or providing as direct support as before, right? And so maximizing independence, that's when we see supported living services, or what they're called independent living services. You'll often hear them referred to as SLS or ILS, right? Helping them develop independent skills to be able to be self-sufficient without the parent. How is the person going to develop self-sufficiency if they continue to depend on the parent? Right. And so at an adult age, it is very appropriate to say, I'm gonna fade back a little bit and I'm gonna ask for more regional center services so my son can develop his independence without me. Right. And then lastly, again, least restrictive environment? How is the service I'm requesting connected to any of these four? Okay, so that there could be more of a foundational legal foundation for why the regional center should be providing you these services and should be providing individualized, person-centered services. And again, these services would be based on goals that were developed by the team, and these goals would be informed by the needs that you establish through a parent report, right? And again, the parent report could include those 7 life areas that we talked about at the beginning. Okay, I see something on the chat. Okay, wonderful. They are continued. Thank you, Myra. Make sure you can see the chat so that you can see the resources and opportunities provided by CSUN FFRC.
And there is a question.
Oh, wonderful.
Do you want me to read it?
Yes, please.
Okay. So it says, if we switch from traditional regional center services to self-determination, do we still have an IEP?
Great question. Just to clarify, it would be an IPP. IEP would be for
I'm
school.
sorry, it was IPP. Sorry about that.
Okay, wonderful. I do that all the time, and my wires kind of cross of IEP and IPP. There's too many P's in this field, right? But so the answer is yes. So if you, and what this question is referring to is regional center provides services either through the traditional way, which is probably what most of us have. You're a regional center client, you have your service coordinator, and through the IPP process, you request services and receive supports. If you go from traditional to the self-determination program, yes, there would still be an IPP meeting, because that IPP meeting is where you talk about the continued needs or the new things, the new needs that he or she has. You would talk about changing circumstances, right, which would also cause very often a change in their needs. You would also talk about underutilized services. So in the self-determination program, your budget is going to be the amount of money that was spent on your son or daughter in the past 12 months. And that budget amount gets determined every year based on what you spent the last 12 months, if that makes sense. So let's say last year, my budget amount was $50,000, but everything went so well, right? Or actually, let me switch that example around. Everything went well, but there were some services that were not provided consistently because you weren't able to get employees to work those hours. So this IPP meeting would allow you to demonstrate, hey, I had 50,000, but I only used 33, not because I didn't need the service, but because I didn't have enough employees, or it was COVID, right? Or some other, knock on wood, let's not call upon another pandemic, but something happened that prevented me from having all the services. So that IPP meeting is going to be your opportunity to discuss that budget with the IPP team and redetermine and adjust that budget as needed. So in short, yes, you would still have an IPP meeting, and the focus would sort of be the same: establishing the need, making sure you've got the same goals based on your person-centered plan, okay? And sort of discussing this budget and adjusting it as needed. Do you need less? Do you need more based on the need? That's where all of that will still be discussed, okay? All right, good. Any other question so far?
No, there's nothing in the chat.
Okay, perfect. So we continue. So again, these are the goals of, regional center based on the Lanterman Act. And now I would like to also discuss some limits based on the Lanterman Act. Okay, so one of your, actually, if you don't mind, let me backtrack just a quick second. Earlier, we had a true and false question about if my child has severe behaviors that cause him to be a danger to self or others, regional center, should look for a home outside of the person's home. So that was kind of a trick question, if you would. And the point that I want to make with that question is this one. Know that for Lanterman Act, the first goal is for the person to remain within their own home. So if your son or daughter has severe needs, is sometimes or consistently a risk to themselves or others, the first option should not be a home outside of your personal home. If it is the family's decision that they want their son or daughter to remain within their home, the first order of business and what the regional center should support is the person staying in their own home. So maybe the phrasing of that question, now that I think of it, was not the best. The point I'm trying to make with that question is to identify the first order of business, as severe as the needs of the person may be. The first option should always be for the person to remain within their home. Now, if because of the severity of their behavior and condition, they need more support, then that would be the first option before looking for an institution, a home away from their family home, if that makes sense. So when we talk about least restrictive environment, that is what we're talking about as well, right? As severe as the behaviors or conditions may be, our first option should not be to look away from the person staying in their own home, unless that's what the family and the person wants. But based on the law, right, regional center should do everything possible to offer services and supports for the person to remain within their home. Okay. And I think it might fit here to say we also had another true and false question that said the regional center can provide mental health services if needed. That would be true. And we're going to talk about that, but in this context. Okay. So we're going to answer that question through this slide here. So we talked about goals of the regional center or goals of the Lanterman Act, right? And now we're going to talk about limits under the Lanterman Act. What is true is that the Lanterman Act states, the Lanterman Act states that regional center is the payer of last resort. Regional center should be the last one to pay for services. Therefore, generic services should be first. Okay. And what that means is before we go to regional center, or if we go to regional center and ask for a service, they will always first refer you and ask you if you've already looked elsewhere. That is a limit based on the Lanterman Act. So if regional center has ever kind of referred you out or done something, that is based on the law, right? And let me sort of develop this concept a little bit more through this slide here. So when the law says that generic services are first, and pardon me, I just realized I didn't translate what the doors say. So door number 1 says escuela, which is school. Stay with me, practice your Spanish. Just kidding. But escuela is school. Servicios genéricos is generic services. And centro regional is regional center. Roll that R, okay? Centro regional. So what this concept of generic services, what it means is imagine 3 doors, like the ones that are on your screen, right? And so let's say door number 1 is special education, which offers services and supports to students under special education that have an IEP, okay? So door number 1, a generic service, would be the school. Door number 2 would be other generic services. And by the way, generic services means anything that's not regional center. So under door number 2, consider that this is your insurance, whether private or not, right? This is Medi-Cal. This is IHSS. Door number 2 is SSI. Door number 2 includes, let's say the YMCA has free swimming classes during the summer. If you can demonstrate that you are below a certain income threshold. Okay. Let's say door number 2 includes there is a church in your local community that offers social gatherings every Friday. They do karaoke, they go bowling, so that is some type of social skill group, right? That is generic, because that means regional center is not paying for it. It's actually free. So what the law means by this is, if you could get the service by anyone else before you come knocking on door number 3, which is regional center, please do so. I'm adding the please, right? I'm adding the narrative of it. But the law pretty much is saying regional center can offer you services, but before you knock on their door, go check all the other resources under door number 2 and go knock on your school's door to see if you can get services from them. Okay, so that is a limit of the regional center, or a limit of the regional center based on the Lanterman Act. Okay, now in this scenario, let's talk about the mental health, right? Why the statement that we reviewed earlier is true is because if your son or daughter needs mental health services that are not available through door number 1, door number 2, or that are not appropriate, right? Then you can knock on regional center's door and say, I've already tried to get services from my insurance, from school, I'm not getting it, so I'm coming back to you to ask for this service, right? So let's develop this mental health example, okay? So let's say you go to your insurance, right? Because insurance is usually who can provide the counseling and the mental health support and all of that, right? So let's say you go to your insurance and you ask, my son or daughter needs mental health services. Your primary doctor indeed gives you a referral and says, go to behavioral health and go check out, some mental health services for your son or daughter. Wonderful. But when you get there, right, you explain, my son needs mental health services. He or she, let's say she is, has autism and is nonverbal. And so the agency, who had initially said, oh yeah, we have counselors available, once you mentioned she has autism and she's nonverbal, they may say, oh, okay, our therapists are not trained on autism or disabilities. Let's say that's the case. And or they are not trained, right, on how to do therapy or provide mental health support to someone who has limited communication skills or is nonverbal. Okay, so if that happens, that means the service is not appropriate. It's actually not even available. So what we would want to do in that scenario is get that in writing, right? If that agency from your health insurance told you that we have counselors, but they are not trained to work with individuals with autism, and they are not trained to provide support to someone who is nonverbal, sorry, we can't provide the service. Wonderful. Keep that letter. And that is what we would take now back to regional center and say, hey, I already tried. Let's say in this case, this person is an adult. Okay. So we won't talk about school and door number 1. So let's say they're an adult and you go back to regional center and say, my son or daughter, they need mental health support. I already tried to get it from door number 2 from my insurance. They gave me this letter, right? They don't have trained individuals to work with my son or my daughter with, particular needs, including, she needs communication support during a therapy. So that would be that kind of scenario and that kind of cycle. Okay, so yes, generic services come first, and that is what the law says. And the law also says that the services should be appropriate, right? So if you go to a generic service and the service is not appropriate, then definitely you can go back to regional center. And based on our true false question, if needed, you can indeed access mental health services or other services for your son or daughter based on their needs. Now, a slightly different scenario. Let's say you go to the school and ask for this mental health counseling because maybe your son or daughter is dealing with loss. Maybe it's loss due to the death of a loved one. Maybe it's divorce. Maybe it's a sibling moving away from the home to college, whatever it may be. And your son has really developed some depression, some anxiety based on all these circumstantial things. And so you go to the school and you ask for it. And they say, we are really short on therapists. We do, he does need the counseling support. This is just an example, okay? And let's say the school says we have an 8-month waiting list for your son to be able to see one of our counselors, okay? Let's say this happens under mental health, under door number 2 as well, okay? What can you do there? Put your name on the waiting list, right? For the generic resource, in this case at school, and say, wonderful, let me get on not wonderful, right? Because that wouldn't be the best case scenario, but let's say you say, okay, please put me on the waiting list for my son to receive mental health services from a counselor when they become available. What you can do in that scenario, though, is come back to regional center and say, I am requesting GAP services, okay, GAP. GAP services. And what that means is, regional center, I am asking you to cover the mental health counseling in the interim while I'm on the waiting list for the school district to provide the mental health counseling. Okay, so that is a different scenario where you may go to regional center, even though it says generic services are first. But let's say you're on a waiting list, you can definitely go to regional center and say, I'm on a waiting list. I'm asking you to provide GAP services. Once the school calls me and says, hey, we're ready for you, we have a therapist for you, wonderful. I will stop getting this service from regional center and I'll go get it from door number 1. But for the interim, during this gap of time, I need regional center to cover it. Okay. Those are scenarios that can occur. Okay. So yes, generic services are first, as we saw in this example with the 3 doors, but remembering that regional center, in some instances, can provide that service that either is not appropriate under a generic service or is not currently available because it has a waiting list. They can provide that GAP service. Okay, so let me make sure. Any questions? Wonderful.
Yes, there's one question. I can read it for you. It
Yeah.
says, does that apply to speech and OT therapies as well?
Yes, correct. It does apply. Any service that is either not appropriate through the other 2 doors or that there's a waiting list or whatever it may be, that same scenario, the example applies to speech and language, OT therapy, any other service that you might think of. Okay. So now, there was another true and false question that said, let me make sure. The same person saying, we're on a waiting list for speech, but we haven't been assigned a coordinator yet. My son turned 3 in June. Okay. So as soon as, so once you're assigned a coordinator and you have a IPP meeting, and definitely give me a call if you want to talk more specifically about your case. If he was found eligible a while back and you still haven't been assigned a coordinator and it's sort of been a long time, then we can talk further about that scenario. But in terms of this comment that you made right now, if you are waiting for that IPP meeting, in that IPP meeting, you can request, right, establish the need, let there be a goal, and request the speech for the interim, right? So you can request in that first IPP meeting that you have, you can request speech and gap services for speech, right? And then once you're off the waiting list for speech from wherever you're on the waiting list right now, then you can approach Regional Center and say, thanks, we are now getting it from a generic service, so we can stop the speech through Regional Center, okay? Same goes for, other services like that could be ABA, right? ABA usually is provided through the insurance, but if for some reason you're on a waiting list or there aren't trained, behaviorists that can work with your son, right? There are conditions that are, as we mentioned, 1 in a million, right? I know that we primarily talk about like autism and Down syndrome and all that, but what if it's Angelman syndrome? What if it's Shaw-Gibbs, right? These diagnoses that we don't talk about a lot. There may not be someone who is familiar with that condition who can really meet the need. And so in that scenario, Regional Center might be the most appropriate, right? To help you look for a service, make something work, develop a service, connect with another regional center who may have the service or the provider you need. In that scenario, that's called a courtesy vendorization. So let's say there's a provider that you need, but they're not vendorized with your regional center, but they are vendorized with another regional center in a different area, then you can request what's called a courtesy vendorization, right? Have a courtesy vendorization with my regional center so that I can get services from you because you are appropriate. The ones in my regional center are non-existent, right? If that's the case. And so, yes, so thank you for that question. It does apply to that, okay? Are there any questions, any other questions you see, Myra?
No, I don't see any.
Okay, wonderful. So we're sort of approaching the end. Know that we will start the next session, part 2, in September, is it? Yes, we're in August now. So September, we will continue here, but I'll go briefly through this list and then we will probably end this part 1 of our series. But so 1, yes, generic services come first, but we already talked about all these exceptions and different processes. The least costly provider, yes, that is a limitation and also true, right? So the regional center is required to provide you a service that is appropriate for your need. It doesn't necessarily mean the best provider, okay? It doesn't necessarily mean the best service. It means an appropriate service. Okay. And I smile because I previously used an example of, it's kind of like when someone says, hey, you want to enter a raffle to win a car, and you're like, yeah. And let's say you win and they bring a car and, it's a car, but it's not a car. It's not the Tesla that you were hoping for or the Lexus. I know that was my dream, Lexus. IS300, I think it was a few years ago. But so when you enter a raffle, it's to get a car, right? Not the best car, not your preference of car, not your preference of color or, brand of, is that even how you say it? You get my point. But so same with regional center, right? You have the right to the appropriate service, okay? Not necessarily the best service or to even your preference in some sense. But if you prefer another provider because they are appropriate for your need, absolutely advocate for that. I, before being with the state council, was a provider. And I used to provide adaptive skills and, mental health services through adaptive skills and social skills. And so, sometimes it would come to us and say, hey, they're trying to take away your service and give me someone else. And they told me that it's because it's cheaper, right? So if that other provider was appropriate for them, wonderful. But let's say their son or daughter is nonverbal and say in one agency, in this scenario, in the agency that I worked with, we had several trained staff, including myself, that used augmentative methods of communication, right? Including typing, choice boards, that. And so this is why this person's son was very successful, right? He was, gaining some skills because we could communicate with him. The other provider that maybe they were referring this person to, they had no trained staff in communication, right? And so it came down to the parent expressing, right? It's not that it's my preference. Oh, I prefer them because I really like them. It's not about liking, right? It's not about your preference. It's about my son's need. Provider you're suggesting, you're right, are cheaper, but they're also not appropriate. They don't have staff with the skills that are required to work with my son appropriately, right? And so if you're catching my drift here, every limit is true, but it also has others to consider, right? Yes, generic services could come first, but there are these scenarios where you sort of have to navigate some things, and regional center might still be the one would it be appropriate to provide that service. Second thing we're talking about right now, right? Least cost provider, that is true. However, right, if found in a scenario like the one I described, where you're being referred to a cheaper but not appropriate provider, then you get to navigate and back and say, I'm advocating this appropriate provider. Not because I want to and they're cool and I love, their office. It's not about that. It's my son's needs is what we're providing services for, right? And based on his need, this provider is not appropriate. It's cheaper, but not appropriate. Okay. And so I'm keeping these things in mind. Third, POS purchase policies, purchase of services. There may be certain policies that may limit certain things, but as we discussed earlier, they can have policies. But if policies are ever more restrictive law, then there's some navigating advocacy that you can do. Okay. There may be provider requirements, right? That regional center may not have control over. So if you want this one agency, again, when I was a provider, there might be people who said, this is the most appropriate, but we would say we have no more room in our, right? Regional center kind of can't do anything about that, right? That is a limit for them. They can't force a provider to provide something that they may not be ready for or staffed for or whatever it may be. And then last, and we will develop this a little bit more in our next training, but demonstrate progress. Is true, right? That based on the Lanterman, a service is provided and progress must be demonstrated. If there is no progress, the regional center may come and say, we're no longer going to provide this service because we're seeing that there's no progress. May happen. What I want to provide in terms of advocacy to that point is sometimes a person may not be making progress, and so, yes, maybe the regional center will take away this service, but what the lack of progress demonstrates sometimes is the need for additional services to work on foundational skills that will allow the person to later make progress in this area that they currently are not making progress. I hope that makes sense. A brief example, again, when I was a provider, we had group settings for social skills. And there were times where we would have a person come into our group setting for social skills, but the truth is the group was not appropriate for them. They weren't making progress. It's actually a bit detrimental because group environment was way too stimulating. The group environment, they did yet have the communication to benefit from that group setting. And so regional center would say, they're not making progress. Sometimes us as an agency, we would say, you've come 3 times. You don't feel that this program is what your daughter needs, but just because they're not making progress here doesn't mean let me just take away the service and you're done. What it may mean is they're not appropriate for this group setting right, and they're not making progress. Let's refer to individual services at home, where he gets to develop self-regulation, emotional regulation, and social skills and communication skills to make progress later on in a setting. But right now, the group setting is not a break. So what I'm trying to say with this, they may not be demonstrating progress in a group setting, in one setting, but it may be because they need more support of a foundational skill. And with this, there were several clients that had to exit our groupings. They received individual service for about 2 years, and sometimes we would come back after 2 or 3 years. Now that they have developed foundational skills, they were ready for this group, right? So yes, they must demonstrate progress, and yes, the regional center may take away a service if they're not demonstrating progress, but take that as an opportunity to explore, why aren't they making progress? What foundational skills do they need to develop? Thus, what services, what other services need to provide regional center in order for to develop this skill that right now they're not even able to make progress in? Okay, so these are limits, but again, there are different things and angles to look at it from, and an advocacy opportunity even within these limits. Okay, so I will pause it here. Thank you